The ship slid into New York Harbor at dawn. The prisoners crowded the deck, clutching the railings, staring at the skyline rising from the mist. To them, America had always been a rumor, a country of excess, chaos, and machines that never stopped. Now, for the first time, they saw it. It didn't look like the enemy they had imagined. It looked like the future. The city glittered in the early light. Smoke curled from thousands of chimneys. Cranes swung over the docks like steel giants, feeding ships the size of villages. Trains roared beneath bridges that stretched into the clouds. Everything moved. Everything worked. For the German prisoners, the noise was unbearable. Not because it was loud, but because it was alive. Europe had fallen silent under the weight of its own destruction. Here, across the ocean, the rhythm of industry pulsed like a heartbeat that never stopped. Corporal Franz Adler leaned over the rail, his jaw tight. He'd grown up in Essen, surrounded by factories that once built Germany's pride. Krupp, Thyssen, the humming veins of the Reich's war machine. But this was something else. He turned to his friend beside him. "If this is what their city looks like," he muttered, "what must their factories be?" The guard beside them, a young American in a clean uniform, caught the look on Adler's face and smirked. "Wait until you see the rest of it, buddy." As the ship docked, the Germans were herded down the gangplank. No shouting, no beatings, just order. American MPs checked papers, handed out canteens, loaded them onto waiting trains. Everything ran like clockwork. Adler noticed something strange. The guards didn't look tired. They weren't gaunt or grim. They looked fed, strong, relaxed, as if the war hadn't touched them at all. He thought of his country, where the air itself tasted like ash, where children dug through rubble for food. And here the Americans had time to joke, to smile, to offer cigarettes to their prisoners. The train ride west was a revelation. Outside the window stretched a land that seemed endless, fields of grain, towns that sparkled with neon signs, roads wider than rivers. Every few minutes they passed a factory. Even from a distance, Adler could see smokestacks, rail lines, conveyors, parking lots filled with trucks. "How many people live here?" one of the prisoners asked quietly. The guard shrugged. "About 130 million. The man laughed bitterly. "We were supposed to conquer this?" The train stopped briefly near a junction. Out the window, Adler saw something that would stay with him forever. A freight yard. Hundreds of trains stretching into the horizon, each car loaded with tanks, jeeps, crates, food, everything an army could need. Dozens of workers, men, women, teenagers, moved among them, waving, shouting, laughing. There was no fear in their faces, no desperation, just motion, purpose. It struck him then. This country didn't fight wars like Germany did. It manufactured them. Hours later, the train reached a transfer station somewhere in Pennsylvania. The prisoners disembarked for food. They were led into a canteen. Clean, bright, efficient. Rows of steaming trays. Potatoes, vegetables, bread, milk. Milk. Fresh milk in the middle of a war. Adler stared at his plate, ashamed to feel grateful. He looked up at the guard. "Why?" The man frowned. "Why what?" "Why feed us like this?" The guard shrugged again. "Because we can." It wasn't arrogance. It was fact. The Americans could. They had enough of everything: steel, fuel, food, time. In that moment, Adler understood something his generals never did. Germany had built soldiers. America had built civilization. After the meal, they were marched back to the train. The convoy rolled west again. Somewhere near Pittsburgh, Adler saw the heart of it. The factories. It started as smoke on the horizon. Then the shapes emerged. Towers, furnaces, pipes. Entire cities of iron and light. Sparks flared like stars from the open furnaces. Conveyor belts carried molten metal across catwalks. The sky glowed orange for miles. He pressed his face to the glass, mesmerized. Back home, German factories had gone dark under Allied bombing. But here, the furnaces roared without pause. Men and women worked side by side in overalls, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. Trains screamed in and out, hauling endless loads of steel. One of the prisoners whispered, "How can they make so much?" No one answered. They didn't have words for it. They passed a billboard outside the city limits. It showed a smiling woman with a rivet gun, her hair tied in a red bandana. The slogan read, "We can do it." Weiss, another prisoner, laughed bitterly. "Our posters said Germany above all. Theirs say, we can do it." Maybe that's the difference. When the train stopped for the night, the prisoners were moved into a temporary holding facility, an old warehouse converted into a rest camp. From the windows, they could still see the glow of the factories on the horizon. The air smelled like oil and progress. Adler sat on his bunk and wrote in a small notebook he'd kept hidden since Africa. We thought they were weak because they loved comfort. But maybe comfort is strength. Maybe building for life is harder than building for war. The next morning they were transferred again, deeper into the heartland. Illinois, Ohio, Michigan. Everywhere they looked there were factories. Tractor plants converted to tank production. Car lines churning out jeeps and aircraft engines. Shipyards hundreds of miles from the ocean. One day their train crossed a massive bridge. Below, a river of barges carried steel, oil, and coal toward the coasts. Above them, airplanes thundered overhead, not in formation for war, but ferrying cargo. The rhythm of the engines, the clatter of the trains, the hum of electricity, it all blended into one sound, the sound of a country that had never stopped. When they finally arrived at their destination, a POW camp near Detroit, the prisoners expected another set of barracks. What they saw instead was the beating heart of modernity. Beyond the fences, the Ford River Rouge complex sprawled across the landscape like a city of steel. Adler gripped the fence, speechless. Miles of conveyors, assembly lines, and smokestacks. Trucks rolled out one gate while ships loaded at another. Thousands of workers moved in perfect rhythm. It was mechanical poetry. A guard walked by and saw the look on Adler's face. "Impressive, huh?" he said. "That's just one plant. We've got 100 more like it." Adler nodded slowly. "Then we never had a chance." That night, as the hum of industry echoed across the fields, the prisoners lay awake in silence. They had seen the future, and it wasn't theirs. The air around Detroit tasted like metal. Even from miles away, the sky glowed faintly red at night, as if the city itself was burning. But it wasn't destruction. It was creation. The endless pulse of forges, presses, cranes, and furnaces filled the horizon with light. The prisoners at the nearby camp were soon put to work on auxiliary duties: maintenance, loading, cleaning around the supply yards. Officially, they weren't allowed inside the factories. Unofficially, every day they saw enough to understand that they were standing at the edge of something incomprehensible. For men who came from a country where war had swallowed every resource, the abundance felt almost obscene. Trucks rolled past by the hundreds, painted in fresh olive drab, their engines humming like a symphony. Trains rumbled in, unloaded steel, and left again within the hour. The cycle never stopped. Corporal Franz Adler worked in a repair depot near the Ford River Rouge complex. From where he stood, he could see across the water to the factory's main building, mile after mile of glass and iron, its windows glowing from within like a city made of fire. Steam rose in plumes, horns blared, sirens sounded for shift changes. It was as if the entire nation breathed in unison, inhaling coal and exhaling power. One morning, an American foreman named Bill came over. "Hey, Fritz," he said cheerfully, pointing to a broken pallet jack. "You know how to fix one of these?" Adler blinked. "Maybe," he said in halting English. "Good," Bill said, handing him a wrench. "Then fix it." No shouting, no condescension, just expectation. Adler crouched down, his hands moving on instinct. The tools were better than anything he'd used in Germany. Smooth, precise, almost elegant. Within minutes, the jack lifted cleanly. Bill nodded. "You're good. You work, you eat." Then he turned away, lighting a cigarette. For Adler, that sentence said more about America than any speech. You work, you eat. No ideology, no fear, no Führer, just effort and reward. Later, he was assigned to haul scrap metal toward the plant. A truck passed him on the road, driven by a woman in a blue jumpsuit, her hair tied up in a scarf. She honked and waved. The prisoners stared. Women driving trucks? Women working in factories? In Germany, their wives and sisters had been digging ditches, scavenging for bread. Here they wore lipstick and steel-toed boots. Inside the plant, the rhythm was hypnotic. Conveyor belts snaked across the floors, carrying engines, parts, propellers. Sparks cascaded from welding torches like fireworks. Everywhere the same sound, the clang of hammers, the hiss of steam, the relentless hum of electricity. Weiss, another prisoner, whispered to Adler, "This is madness." Adler shook his head. "No, this is order." The Americans had turned chaos into choreography. Every bolt, every rivet, every worker moved with purpose. It wasn't just production. It was orchestration. At lunch, Adler sat on a crate outside the depot, watching lines of workers file out of the gates. Black, white, men, women, all walking side by side. No segregation in the factory floor. No officer class. No salute. Just people working together. He turned to an older guard sitting nearby. "How do they make them do it?" he asked. The guard shrugged. "They don't make us. We just do." Adler didn't understand. In Germany, obedience came from fear. Here, it seemed to come from belief. Weeks passed. The prisoners began to adjust to their new rhythm. They woke to sirens, marched to work details, repaired tools, moved cargo, cleaned machinery. But each day, their shock deepened. They saw rail cars loaded with engines leaving every hour. They saw trucks rolling off assembly lines faster than they could count. They saw an entire factory switch overnight from building cars to manufacturing aircraft engines. Once they were taken past the Willow Run plant, the massive complex where B-24 bombers were produced. It looked endless, a steel serpent coiling across the fields. The Americans said one bomber rolled off the line every hour. The prisoners didn't believe it until they saw the proof. At the end of the line, a bomber emerged into daylight, its wings gleaming. Workers stood below, clapping, laughing, as if celebrating the birth of a child. A woman wiped oil from her hands and said proudly, "That one's for my brother in the Pacific." Weiss whispered, "We build for Hitler's glory. They build for family." The distinction hit like a hammer. One day, an American engineer gave a short talk to the POW work crew. He explained, almost casually, that the US had more than 300,000 planes, 100,000 tanks, and millions of trucks in service. "You can't win against numbers like that," he said with a grin. "We make more in a week than the Nazis can in a month." The prisoners laughed bitterly, but the engineer wasn't boasting. He was just telling the truth. That night, in the barracks, Adler sat with Weiss under the dim bulb. "Do you see it now?" he said. "We thought the Americans were decadent because they liked comfort. But comfort isn't decadence. It's progress." Weiss nodded slowly. They turned efficiency into a religion. A few days later, the prisoners were marched past the General Motors plant. Through the fence, they saw miles of conveyor belts feeding trucks into endless lines. It was mechanized poetry, every machine part sliding into place as if guided by invisible hands. Weiss stared for a long time, then said quietly, "This is their army." He was right. America's army didn't march on ideology. It rolled on wheels, it flew on wings, it floated on steel. It was an army built not in bunkers, but in blueprints. Months later, the prisoners learned of Hiroshima. The guards didn't talk about it much, but the whispers spread fast. One bomb, one city, gone. The idea was beyond comprehension. The men who had once worshipped the myth of German science now sat in stunned silence. "They did it," Adler said, finally. "They built the gods we only dreamed of." The realization crushed and liberated him at once. Crushed because it proved Germany's defeat wasn't military. It was intellectual. Liberated because it showed that a nation built on knowledge and cooperation could outlast one built on fear. In the following weeks, the prisoners worked harder than before, not out of obedience, but fascination. Some asked for English books, engineering manuals, newspapers. They wanted to understand how this machine worked, not just its engines, but its people. One evening after lights out, Weiss whispered, "Do you think we could ever build something like this back home?" Adler answered, "If we learn the right lesson, maybe." The lesson wasn't about steel or oil. It was about faith in ordinary people. Because that was America's secret. The machine didn't control the people. The people controlled the machine, and they did it willingly. The more the German prisoners saw of America, the more impossible it became to hate it. The country didn't fit into the world they had been trained to understand. It wasn't ruled by fear, or held together by orders shouted from above. It worked because everyone, somehow, believed in the same invisible idea: that life could get better. That belief was in everything: the factories, the schools, the roads, even the way people spoke. It wasn't arrogance. It was confidence, an unshakable faith in progress. For men raised in a nation that worshipped obedience, it was a revelation. Franz Adler began to notice patterns. The Americans never waited for permission. They solved problems before someone told them to. When a machine broke, they didn't wait for an engineer. They fixed it. When a truck got stuck in mud, everyone, officers included, pushed. There was no, "That's not my job." Everyone's job was to make it work. In Germany, efficiency came from fear. Here, it came from freedom. One morning during work detail, Adler overheard two factory workers talking. One complained that management had changed the shift schedule again. The other shrugged. "That's how it goes, you adapt." Adler frowned. Adaptation wasn't a virtue in his world, it was weakness. In Germany, you obeyed or you broke. In America, you bent and kept moving. He thought about that all day. In the barracks that night, he told Weiss, "They treat flexibility like discipline." Weiss nodded. "And that's why they'll never break." Weeks passed. The prisoners grew used to the rhythm of the machine. But what truly astonished them was the rhythm of the people. On Sundays, the guards took them on controlled walks outside the camp, through small towns, past schools, churches, diners. Every town looked alive. Streets swept clean, shop windows full, children laughing. It didn't feel like a nation at war. They passed a public school one afternoon. Through the open windows came the sound of a lesson, children reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. Adler didn't understand every word, but one line stayed with him. "With liberty and justice for all." Justice for all. Not justice for the strong, not order for the obedient. Justice for all. It was an idea so simple, so fragile, that it could only work if people truly believed it. And they did. The guards sometimes argued among themselves, about politics, about Roosevelt, about unions. But they never seemed afraid. In Germany, disagreement meant danger. Here, it meant democracy. Adler began to realize that America's real weapon wasn't the bomb, or the tank, or the factory. It was permission. The permission to think, to question, to act. At the camp library, the prisoners could borrow books. Most took novels, dictionaries, or magazines. Adler borrowed a history book. He wanted to understand how this place became what it was. He read about the Depression, the dust storms, the years when people had nothing, and how they built again. No Führer, no savior, just people. Farmers, mechanics, dreamers. They built bridges, highways, and factories not because they were ordered to, but because they believed that hard work could change fate. In the margins of the book, Adler wrote, "In Germany, the people serve the state. In America, the state serves the people." That is the difference between a weapon and a tool. The more he read, the more everything made sense. The factories, the films, the kindness. They weren't contradictions. They were consequences of the same idea, that power was collective, not commanded. Weiss joined him in reading. Together they discussed what they saw and what it meant. "Their war machine," Weiss said one night, "runs on optimism. It's insane." Adler smiled faintly. "Maybe optimism is a kind of fuel. We ran on fear. It burned hotter, but shorter." One day, a group of prisoners was assigned to help unload cargo at a nearby airfield. As they worked, they watched a new kind of aircraft roll down the runway. Sleek, silver, faster than anything they had seen. It lifted off smoothly, banking into the clouds. "That's the new P-80, said an American officer nearby. "Jet engine, built in less than 2 years. 2 years. Germany had spent decades dreaming of such power and failed. America had done it while fighting 2 wars. Adler turned to Weiss. "They don't just build machines, they build futures." He wasn't exaggerating. Even in wartime, America's production never stopped evolving. Factories that made tanks 1 month were producing tractors the next. Aircraft plants became car plants. Steel mills built houses as easily as they built hulls. The line between peace and war didn't exist. It was all creation. Adler began to realize that America's secret wasn't industry itself. It was faith in industry. A cultural religion where progress replaced conquest and invention replaced obedience. In the German mind, everything flowed from the top down, from the leader, the party, the plan. In the American mind, everything rose from the bottom up, from the worker, the inventor, the dreamer. One afternoon, an American foreman saw Adler examining a massive stamping press. "You like machines?" he asked. "Yes," Adler said. The foreman grinned. "Then don't just look at them. Think how to make them better." It was a casual comment, but it landed like thunder. Think how to make them better. No German officer had ever said those words to a soldier. Improvement was not the duty of the individual. It was the privilege of the elite. That night, Adler wrote again in his notebook, "This is what freedom looks like. Not speeches, not flags. The freedom to fix what is broken." Months turned into seasons. The war ended, but the prisoners stayed. Some began teaching themselves English. Others wrote letters home describing the unbelievable things they had seen. Women welding, children in school, cities without rubble, people unafraid. In Germany, those letters would circulate like legends. Men still fighting on the front would whisper, "In America, the factories never stop. In America, the prisoners are treated better than we are." The words planted seeds, seeds that would survive the defeat. By the end of 1945, many prisoners had been moved to different states, Texas, Kansas, Ohio. Wherever they went, the pattern was the same: order, abundance, efficiency. America seemed to be everywhere at once. Weiss once asked a guard, "How can your country be so rich and still fight a war so far away?" The guard shrugged. "We don't fight alone. We build together." It was the simplest explanation and the most powerful. For the Germans, it became clear that what they had lost was never just a war. They had lost the ability to imagine a future that wasn't ruled by fear. The mind of America was the mind of possibility. And that was something you couldn't bomb, couldn't invade, couldn't destroy. It was the idea that built the modern world. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over. But in America, the engines never stopped. The country didn't slow down to celebrate. It accelerated. To the German prisoners scattered across the Midwest and South, it felt as though they were living inside a giant organism, a living machine that breathed smoke and sang in steel. Everywhere they looked, there was movement. Freight trains screaming across bridges, convoys of trucks rolling down new highways, factories glowing through the night like furnaces of creation. The scale was beyond comprehension. In Germany, a factory was a single building, an instrument of control. In America, a factory was a city. Entire towns existed for one purpose: to make, to build, to move. Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago, each one pulsed like a mechanical heart, pumping out engines, weapons, and dreams. For men who had seen their own homeland reduced to rubble, it was almost mystical. Corporal Franz Adler stood on a hill outside the Ford River Rouge complex one evening, watching the smoke roll across the skyline. The sun set behind the chimneys, painting the air gold and red. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. Weiss laughed softly. "Beautiful? It's a monster." Adler shook his head. "No, it's proof." "Proof of what?" "That a nation can build its strength on something other than fear." They stood there for a long time, listening to the endless hum. It wasn't the sound of war. It was the sound of belief. Inside the factories, the rhythm was hypnotic. Steel poured into molds, sheets clanged, engines roared to life. The smell of oil and sweat filled the air, but beneath it all was a strange harmony. Men and women worked side by side, black and white, young and old, immigrants and natives. No overseers with whips, no officers shouting orders, just foremen giving instructions and workers following because they wanted to finish what they started. Weiss once asked a foreman, "How do you keep them working so hard?" The man shrugged. "It's their job, but it's also their life. If the factory stops, everything stops." That was America's unspoken law, the democracy of motion. Everyone depended on everyone else. The worker on the line knew that his bolt held a nation together just as surely as the president's pen did. One Sunday, the prisoners were allowed to attend a local church service under guard. The pastor's sermon was about work. "God made man to build," he said, "and when we build together, we honor him." Adler listened, stunned. In Germany, work had been sacrifice, for the state, for the Führer, for glory. Here, it was service for one another. After the service, an American mechanic shook Adler's hand. "You'll go home soon," he said. "When you rebuild, do it better." Adler could only nod. Weeks later, the prisoners were sent to help with maintenance at a steel plant in Ohio. The sheer size of it was terrifying. The furnaces burned hotter than anything he had seen even at Krupp. Cranes the size of houses moved slabs of metal like toys. Workers laughed and shouted over the noise. They didn't act like soldiers. They acted like artists. For the Germans, who had seen their own factories bombed into silence, it felt like walking through the veins of a god. One day, an American supervisor invited Adler and a few others to tour the assembly line. He explained every step, the molds, the stamping, the cooling. At the end, he pointed to a newly forged engine block. "That's power," he said, "not because it moves tanks, but because it moves people." That phrase stayed with Adler. Because it moves people. Back in the camp, he wrote in his notebook, "Their machines do not serve tyranny. They serve purpose. They are temples, not prisons." The more he saw, the more he understood that America's strength wasn't just mechanical, it was moral. Every factory was a cathedral to possibility. Every worker a believer. They didn't chant slogans or salute flags. Their patriotism was the click of gears, the hum of power lines, the steady beat of progress. In the evenings, the guards sometimes played the radio. Big band music, advertisements, baseball games. Even the commercials amazed the Germans. A voice would say, "Better living through chemistry," or "America's future runs on steel." It wasn't propaganda. It was faith disguised as marketing. Weiss chuckled one night. "They've turned capitalism into a religion." Adler replied, "And religion into production." Yet beneath the humor, there was admiration. The prisoners began to see that American freedom was structured, disciplined, but voluntary. It wasn't chaos. It was cooperation. Millions of people moving in sync without being forced. In Germany, obedience had been mandatory. In America, it was chosen. That was the terrifying brilliance of it. It worked because people wanted it to. At one plant, the prisoners met a man named Sam, a foreman whose father had come from Poland. Sam explained that his family spoke little English when they arrived, but now his sons were in college. "That's America," he said proudly. "You start at the bottom. You climb." Adler thought about his own country, where class and rank were walls, not ladders. In Germany, a man's birth defined his limits. In America, his effort defined his worth. The prisoners watched in awe as convoys of finished goods rolled out of the factories. Planes, tanks, trucks, but also tractors, typewriters, refrigerators. Even as the war wound down, production didn't stop. The same assembly lines that had built the tools of destruction were now building the tools of life. "We've seen their weapon," Weiss said quietly one night. "Now we're seeing their victory." By 1946, the scale of American output was mythic. The U.S. produced half the world's manufactured goods. Its railways carried more freight than all of Europe combined. Its energy grid lit up continents. And it had done it all without turning into a dictatorship. The prisoners began to talk among themselves, cautiously at first. They compared notes, stories, letters from home. Many admitted that they no longer saw the Americans as enemies. Some called them builders, others engineers of the world. Adler wrote in his journal, "They do not rule with guns, but with blueprints. They do not conquer by marching, but by manufacturing." When news came that Germany would soon be divided, the prisoners felt a chill. But Adler felt something else, a sense of responsibility. "We saw what's possible," he told Weiss. "If we go home and do nothing, we deserve the ruins." In the months that followed, that sense would spread. When the prisoners were finally repatriated, many carried notebooks filled with sketches, diagrams, and ideas. They had come as soldiers. They left as apprentices of a new civilization. They had walked through the factories of democracy, and they would never forget what they had seen. Winter 1945. The snow along the fences of the camp glowed orange from the reflection of nearby factories. Even at night, the machine never slept. Freight trains howled through the cold, their wheels throwing sparks into the darkness. The Americans called it progress. The Germans called it proof. Proof that the war had been over long before they'd surrendered. Franz Adler sat near the stove in the barracks, staring at the flicker of the fire. Around him, men murmured softly, their voices dull, tired. They were no longer angry. Anger required energy. All they had left was thought. He opened his notebook again. The pages were almost full. Notes, sketches, fragments of realization. At the top of one page he had written, "We lost because they built while we destroyed." Weiss looked over his shoulder. "Still writing?" Adler nodded. "Trying to understand." "Understand what?" "How they do it. How they win without boasting." Weiss laughed quietly. "Because they don't need to. We built monuments to ourselves. They built engines." It was true. America's victory didn't wear uniforms. It wore work clothes. Its medals were not on soldiers' chests, but on factory walls, in production numbers, in steel tonnage. Its greatness wasn't shouted. It was welded. As Christmas approached, the guards decorated the camp canteen with paper garlands and lights. They played music from a radio, swing, jazz, Christmas carols. The prisoners were invited to join. At first, most refused. But when the smell of food filled the air, roast turkey, mashed potatoes, pie, they drifted in one by one. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just warmth. An American officer raised a glass. "To peace," he said simply. "May we all find a way to live better than we fought." The translator repeated the words in German. The hall was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, the men began to nod. After dinner, a few of the guards rolled out a projector. A movie again. Meet John Doe, an old Capra film about honesty, despair, and hope. The story of a man who pretends to be a hero and becomes one by accident. As the film played, the Germans watched the faces on the screen. Ordinary people struggling, failing, trying again. They looked like real human beings, not propaganda figures. They saw America not as an empire, but as a mirror. By the end, when Gary Cooper stands on the roof, refusing to give up on the idea of goodness, something broke inside the room. No applause, no laughter. Just stillness. Adler sat with his hands folded, the light of the projector flickering across his face. He whispered, "They believe in hope the way we believed in power." That night he wrote, "Our strength came from fear. Theirs comes from faith. Fear builds armies. Faith builds nations." Weeks later, news came from Europe. Germany was being divided. Cities still in ruins, millions homeless. The Reich, gone. The men read the headlines in stunned silence. Some cursed, some wept. But most simply stared. The words occupation zones felt like a verdict. Adler folded the newspaper carefully and set it aside. "We wanted to rule the world," he said quietly. "We couldn't even rule ourselves." Over the next months, something began to change inside the prisoners. They no longer called themselves soldiers. The camp's routines, work, meals, rest, became more than survival. They became a kind of apprenticeship. Some men started attending English lessons offered by the guards. Others volunteered for extra work shifts just to stay near the factories. It wasn't obedience anymore, it was fascination. Weiss became obsessed with the idea of rebuilding. "When we go home," he said one night, "we can do it like this, organized, modern, without hate." Adler nodded but said nothing. The thought scared him. Could Germany rebuild without anger? Could it create without conquest? One morning, an American officer named Captain Miller visited the camp. He had fought in Normandy and lost 2 brothers in Europe. Yet his tone was calm, almost kind. He addressed the prisoners directly. "I saw what war does," he said. "I saw your cities, your people, your children. But I also saw what you can do when you build instead of destroy. Remember that when you go home." His words struck deeper than any bullet. When the translator finished, a prisoner in the back stood and asked, "Why are you telling us this? We were your enemies." Miller hesitated. Then he said, "Because my country doesn't need enemies. It needs examples." For the rest of the day, the camp buzzed with talk. "Examples of what?" someone asked. "Examples of who we could have been," another answered. The next Sunday, the guards took a small group to visit a nearby industrial exposition, part of a morale campaign to show Americans the fruits of their victory. The prisoners walked through vast halls filled with machines, engines, cars, and prototypes of new aircraft. A banner read, "The future is now." Adler stopped beneath it, staring up at the shining letters. In that moment, he understood the final humiliation and the final truth. They had been fighting yesterday's war, for yesterday's world, with yesterday's pride. Back in the barracks, he wrote one final entry. "The Reich is dead, but the idea of progress lives. In them. Maybe it can live in us, too." As spring arrived, the camp's snow melted, and rumors spread that repatriation would begin soon. Men packed their few belongings. They were going home, but not as they had come. Their pride was gone, but in its place was something new, something fragile and alive. Humility. The guards came to say goodbye. Some shook hands, others simply nodded. One American said, "Remember what you saw here." Adler smiled faintly. "We will," he said. "That's what frightens me most." As the trucks rolled out of the camp, the prisoners looked back one last time. The smokestacks were still rising in the distance, the hum of engines still filling the air. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Weiss said softly, "We thought we were the most advanced people in the world." Turns out the future spoke English. The others didn't laugh. They just watched the factories fade behind them, those endless temples of motion, and realized that the sound of machines was the sound of civilization. And for the first time, they didn't feel envy. They felt possibility. The ship home was silent. No songs, no marching, no anthems. Only the slow rhythm of the sea and the thoughts of men who no longer knew what to call themselves. They had left Germany as conquerors, arrived in America as prisoners, and now returned as something in between. Witnesses. Franz Adler stood on deck, the wind cold on his face, the Atlantic gray and endless. He no longer felt pride or defeat, only clarity. In America, he had seen something more powerful than victory. Continuity. The Americans hadn't just won a war. They had built a world that couldn't be destroyed by bombs. Behind him, the other men smoked and stared into the fog. No one spoke of the Reich anymore. The word felt extinct, like a superstition from another century. Weiss broke the silence. "Do you think they'll ever believe us?" "Who?" "Back home, when we tell them what we saw." Adler shook his head. "No, not yet. Maybe one day." When the ship reached Bremerhaven, the harbor was barely recognizable. What had once been a proud port was now a graveyard of cranes and skeleton ships. The air smelled of salt and smoke. The docks were lined with rubble. As the men disembarked, the German officials checked their papers, stamped them, and waved them off with mechanical indifference. There was no welcome, no one to greet them. Just silence. Adler walked through the ruins of his old world. Streets where buildings had once stood were now open wounds of stone. Children played in craters. Women queued for bread. Men pushed carts of broken bricks that had once been their homes. He passed what used to be a cinema. Its facade was cracked, its doors gone. The marquee still clung to a single word: Licht. Light. He smiled sadly. Even in ruin, the word remained. Over the next weeks, the returning POWs tried to rebuild their lives. Some took jobs clearing rubble. Others joined reconstruction teams. But something inside them had changed. They worked differently, slower, steadier, more deliberate. They didn't bark orders or quote slogans. They cooperated. They planned. Weiss found work helping to rebuild a power station. On his first day, he told the foreman, "In America, they fixed everything together. No ranks." The foreman laughed. "This is Germany, not America." Weiss nodded. Maybe that's why they won. Word spread quietly among former POWs. They met in cafes, in half-A's and half-standing churches, in rebuilt libraries. They talked about what they'd seen. Not the guns, not the guards, but the people. How Americans worked, how they thought, how they believed in progress as a duty, not a dream. Out of those conversations came new ideas: cooperative workshops, local trade associations, vocational schools. Some of the men who had once been prisoners became engineers, teachers, mayors. They carried pieces of that American machine inside them. Not its metal, but its logic. And soon the miracle began. Factories reopened. Roads were rebuilt. Trains ran again. The cities started to hum. In 1948, a new currency stabilized the economy. In the 1950s, a new word appeared in the newspapers: Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Adler watched it unfold with quiet awe. Germany was breathing again. Not marching, not shouting, just breathing. The rhythm was familiar. The hum of work, the clang of steel, the heartbeat of creation. But this time it wasn't driven by fear. It was driven by necessity, by hope. He saw young men on scaffolds laughing, women in factories assembling radios, children walking to new schools with books under their arms. It reminded him of the first time he saw Detroit's skyline through the fog. The same fire, the same will. But now it was theirs. One day Weiss came to visit him. They sat outside a cafe rebuilt from the ashes. "Do you ever think about it?" Weiss asked. "America." "Everything," Adler smiled faintly. "Every day. But not with envy anymore. With gratitude." Weiss nodded. "We copied their machines." Adler shook his head. "No. We copied their faith." Years passed. The cities grew taller, the factories busier. The ruins faded into memory, but the lesson never did. In the early 1960s, Adler was invited to a conference of industrial planners. He spoke quietly, without notes. "The Americans taught us that power is not in domination," he said. "It is in organization. The man who builds a bridge builds peace." After the speech, a young journalist approached him. "Were you really a prisoner?" "Yes." "And they treated you well?" Adler smiled. "Better than we deserved. Better than we understood." The journalist hesitated. "Do you still think about the factories?" Adler looked out the window at the cranes and smokestacks beyond. "Every time I hear a machine start, I think of them. Not the Americans. The idea they built. The faith that work could be moral." Later that night, walking home through the glowing streets of post-war Germany, he passed a cinema. The sign above the door read, "Tonight, the bridge on the River Kwai." He bought a ticket. Inside, the lights dimmed and the familiar hum of a projector filled the room. On the screen, men built a bridge in the jungle. Not for glory, but for meaning. As Adler watched, he felt tears rise in his eyes. The story was about prisoners, but he understood it differently now. The bridge wasn't just wood and steel. It was civilization. When the film ended, he stayed in his seat. The audience filed out. The lights came up. A young usher approached and said, "Sir, we're closing." Adler nodded. "I know. I just wanted to remember." He stood and walked outside. The night air was cool, the city alive with motion. Cars, lights, laughter. The sound of a nation that had rebuilt itself. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "They defeated us without hatred, and taught us how to win without war." The streetlights flickered like beacons. Somewhere in the distance, a factory whistle blew. The same note he'd heard years ago in America. He smiled. The sound no longer belonged to them. It belonged to everyone. And as he walked home, the machines of Germany sang quietly in the dark. Not the song of conquest, but the hymn of rebirth.